think this has likely been my easiest review of 2023, but definitely still with some surprises, because I knew absolutely nothing about REL's new Classic 98 subwoofer. In fact, I assumed it was maybe a T5X that had been redesigned into a more contemporary looking cabinet, and I would have been fine with that, but that's not what it is. And the reason I wanted to review it is because I wanted to find out whether it would be a perfect partner to speakers like my Mission 770s that you can see there behind me, or maybe the perfect partner to any number of the latest or the new retro looking speakers. I've looked at a number of them, just looked at the Revival Audio Atalante 5. So the REL Classic aesthetically could be a perfect partner to those types of speakers, because I know all too well that, you know, having a giant black box in the room, I'm fine with it in here, but I can imagine it being difficult for some people to maybe have. And if the subwoofer matches the hatch with the speakers from a design point of view, it might be easier to have, and definitely easier to have multiples of them. And while we are talking about aesthetics, I think REL have done a very nice job here. The Classic 98 looks classy and nice without being too old manish, so still appealing to a younger audiophile generation, and I mean no offence there to anyone. And let's face it, unless you knew it was a subwoofer, you would never know that is what it is, and I think that is the whole point. And it's also well built, pretty solid and pretty heavy at 18 kilograms, but not backbreaking like some subwoofers are. And design-wise, in REL's own words, the Classic 98 is for audiophiles who yearn for a vintage REL styling and sound. And here was my first surprise. The Classic 98 uses a 10-inch paper driver that is down-firing. And there is a different manufacturing process for the outer driver to the inner cap, but it's all paper. And an all-paper driver, of course, is distinctly different to the carbon fibre drivers that I've been looking at for a large part of this year in the REL number 31s. And of course, you know, I don't think any other REL subwoofer uses a paper driver. So that's really, really interesting. It was really interesting to me to learn about this. And I think it's got to have had some influence over what I've been hearing. And I haven't looked at the amplifier plate much in this review, so I only noticed right at the end the gold colouring for the labelling, which is very regal or vintage maybe. And there is a standard set of controls here for high level crossover and gain, line level gain, as well as a couple of inputs and a phase adjustment switch. So simplicity really, but it's all we need. There is no app control here or anything like that, and you shouldn't really expect that from a RELs because that's not really what they offer, but they do offer wireless solutions if you'd rather connect the subwoofer to the subwoofer wirelessly rather than via a direct cable. There's options to do that if you choose to. And I think what's more important really with an amplifier plate is not what we can see, it's actually what we can't see, what's on the back, what's on the other side, and that is a 300 watt Class D amplifier. And there's nothing vintage about Class D, of course, and I would say if you are a amplifier snob who, you know, thinks really hard about the type of amplifier topologies, you know, preference for Class AB, I would say here definitely don't judge a book by its cover, because that Class D combined with that paper driver actually sounds, I think, nothing like how you might expect it to. And the feet are just feet, of course, but they are also styled nicely, and the rounded off edges of the top of the REL and that logo plate all add to the overall appeal, and I think that is important given the price of £1,299. But to be honest, I think some of this you might not even really see or notice, because it's interesting. I found that the wood finish of the REL just makes it more transparent. I don't know if that's the right word. Makes it kind of disappear. It definitely doesn't stand out anything like as much as maybe a gloss black or a gloss white subwoofer would. And I don't know if it's because it's not gloss, or whether it's because it's that slightly darker color because it's wood. I'm really not sure. Maybe it's because it's got like a pattern which makes it, you know, kind of like a tiger, a little bit of camo going on. It just definitely doesn't stand out in the room or dominate, or, you know, have the same kind of presence in the room as a big black or maybe white subwoofer would, and that could be something really important to you. For the assessment of a subwoofer's performance and sound quality, I actually think those two things can be separated, because a subwoofer's maximum output performance, raw performance, of course it can be measured, and that can be very useful information, especially if you're putting together a large home cinema. But I think for 2-channel use in a smaller to medium sized room, that's not quite so important. I think much more important is how you situate and set up a subwoofer, and I can only really talk to you about how I did that in here and in this room, and how I integrated the Classic 98 with the speakers. My room is a small room. It's about 16 feet long, I think, about 12.5 feet wide, and about 8.5 feet tall. So it is a small room, but it's also an extensively acoustically treated room with a lot of bass trapping, especially around where I sit and listen. And subwoofer placement in a room is critically important. I think everyone knows this. And I don't know why I did it, but I placed the Classic 98 down in the middle of the room, equal distance between the Mission 770 speakers, kind of in line with them. And I have never placed a subwoofer in this position in my room before, so I've never measured one. I have no idea how that spot in this room would perform. But straight away I could hear there was definitely some merit in it. I could hear that there was definitely some merit in it, especially once I'd started to really dial in the crossover and the level. And to clarify, I tested the Classic 98 using REL's high-level connection method, which essentially sends a full-range signal to the subwoofer straight from the amplifier. And that signal gets filtered in the subwoofer, so only bass below the crossover that you have set plays from the subwoofer. So I spent a little bit of time just slightly moving the subwoofer left and right, backwards and forwards, to try and find a spot where I thought was audibly, the bass was timed nicely with the speakers, and I set the phase to be correct also. And then for setting up the subwoofer, I did something different, I think, to what a lot of people do. I didn't set the crossover and level just to try and support where the Mission 770's bass rolled off. I think that's a waste of a really good subwoofer. I actually set the crossover point and I listened. I went up and up and up, and sometimes you'll hit a point where you think maybe I've gone too far. In my experience, you should keep going just in case you haven't gone far enough. And I ended up looking for a point where the bass from the REL was helping to bring out more from the speakers, not support them, bring out more from them from a level and point of view. And I actually focus on the vocal range when I'm doing this. And I think I ended up setting the crossover pretty high. I'm guessing 80 or 90 hertz, which is not high really for a good subwoofer, but maybe high by compared to what other people do. So that creates essentially like a double bass situation where the subwoofer and the speakers are essentially playing the same bass. But so long as they're in phase and so long as they're time aligned correctly, this is an advantage, not a disadvantage, because then we have multiple points or multiple sources of bass in the room, essentially like having more subwoofers in the room. So more sources of bass in a room naturally will give you a more even spread and a more even bass response. So that's one of the big advantages, and I thought long and hard about this. This is one of the big advantages to the REL high-level system. And the benefit of adding the Classic 98 to the Mission 770 was much bigger than I was expecting it to, because of its benefits to the vocals. And it was actually quite transformative, from being very good to quite special, with the REL helping to flesh out the vocals much more and bring out quite a special 3D rounded character to them that I didn't know the Missions could actually do. And this was, of course, massive to just my enjoyment, how much I enjoyed sitting listening to music. And I do just wonder whether it's that paper driver. I really don't know whether it's allowed this to happen or been influential. I really don't know, but it definitely got me thinking about it. And listening to big female vocalists like Melody Gardot or Carrie Bremnes, with and without the REL, there was still a very nice vocal and sound without, of course, but it just was not nearly as special as with. Then there were the obvious benefits of having a subwoofer in the system with more bass, power and presence for music like drum and bass or dance music, where again the Missions do a really good job on their own, but they just don't give you the full power and presence and scale of bass that I think this music is supposed to deliver, or at least I enjoy from it. And for me, having more bass, and it's not just deep bass, it's actually mid bass. The benefits of that, I think, are very, very far reaching. I've mentioned vocals. I think, obviously that's important, but the overall sense of warmth to a system. How warm does the music feel and how balanced is the whole sound based on how much warmth there is. I think that's so crucial, and that's a great thing about having a subwoofer that you can cross over higher and control this with, because you can control that to some degree and add a bit more warmth if there's not quite as much there. And I really value warmth in music because I think it makes the difference between it being really enjoyable to listen to as opposed to something that's a bit brittle and a bit hard. Warmth and pressure and feeling in the room, it's just nice. It's just more pleasing and pleasant. So that's an obvious advantage, but there's another more audiophile advantage, I think, and that comes from sound staging. And I think spaciousness within an audio system or a hi-fi system is a big thing for us audiophiles. We value this a lot. And I think sometimes a hi-fi system sounds more spacious to us because it's hollowed out. So there's not enough bass, and therefore that creates a bit more space here and a bit more space there. And it's kind of more audiophile, but it's not. I actually think when you get the bass right, especially from a right level, and a right level actually means quite a lot of bass, what actually happens is that spaciousness actually improves because all of the bass fundamentals for all of these things around the soundstage fills in. And then all of a sudden, all of these elements within the soundstage that you've been appreciating now sound larger and more full in size, and actually adds more scale and space to the sound. And I can give a great example of this would be with quite an audiophile track actually, Birds by Dominic Feels Amy. You can get this on all streaming servers, and it starts off with a big double bass, and that double bass can sound big or it can sound really big. That's an easy one. But what's more interesting is later in that track there are some side vocalists. I suppose they're backing vocalists, but they're very much out to the side, and they can be really out to the side on a good hi-fi system. And the difference between having the bass full and right means those vocalists will sound full size, like a full-sized human being standing to the sides of you singing. When the bass is not right and not there, those vocalists shrink down, and it just sounds like like a mouse maybe. It's just creating like an effect. So the difference between an effect and having a full-size person standing there singing next to you is huge. That's absolutely huge. And what was interesting is just one Classic 98 subwoofer was able to produce quality enough bass, big enough bass to support the missions, to create this effect in Birds by Dominic Feels Amy. But without the subwoofer, it was back to that effect being small. With the subwoofer, full-sized singers. So that's like an obvious, tangible, massive uptake in performance, and that happens in all music pretty much. Obviously, the more spacious and soundstagey the music is, the better, but every music sounds better. All music sounds better when you have more bass and the right amount of bass. Good bass, not bad bass, not boomy bass. Tight, controlled, warmth, quality bass. And I think when it's that good, the more of it, the merrier. The more, the merrier. But I do have a couple of question marks over the Classic 98. I found for big bass modern music, the REL delivered, as I mentioned, enough bass presence and power to satisfy me, and I'm as fussy as it gets. And it could give me enough room warmth and pressure feeling on my body to make me kind of appreciate how, dance music and similar is supposed to be. And it was actually more impressive than I was expecting it to be from a 300 watt 10-inch subwoofer. I was aware at the same time that bigger subwoofers, probably more expensive, but bigger subwoofers seem to hit the room slightly differently. They hit the room big and bold like a subwoofer with a subwoofer type effect, whereas the Classic 98 didn't really do that. It tended to hit the room with its bass more like how a larger speaker would. So that's definitely a difference and something to consider, because maybe it wouldn't hit you enough depending on what you're coming from or what you're expecting or looking for. But there is a pro to that potential con. What I've found is the bigger the subwoofer, when they hit a smaller room like mine, they can cause the room resonances to ring more because there's just more pressure going out in those regions where, I still have the problems in this room despite all the acoustic treatment. So with those subwoofers, I always feel, all I need to do is put some good quality bass management in there, some good quality DSP, and that's not an issue. However, with the Classic 98, its balance of sound or its performance kind of power ratio seemed to work really nicely in this room. So it wasn't there was enough presence and bass pressure and nice feeling, but it wasn't hitting the room modes as aggressively as some bigger subwoofers have done in here. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't perfect. There'd still be the odd song that would just hit that note really big and it would cause some ringing, some less composed bass is probably the best way to describe it, but it was with less music rather than more. So that's definitely an advantage, maybe an advantage to you if you're in a smaller room and you're not going to be using any bass management or DSP. Definitely something to think about. And then the other question mark maybe with the REL could be what I would class as like a smaller subwoofer syndrome, where there'd just be some notes that it would create that didn't seem quite as clean or as composed as some others. And I would describe this as more of a bass note warble rather than a clean note. So it's more of a wah, 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 rather than a solid note. And now this is something most people probably wouldn't even notice and hear. But I am extremely fussy when it comes to bass, and I hear everything, I analyse absolutely everything. So occasionally the bass note would be a little bit wobbly rather than a solid tone, but it's hard to know how much of that is placement, how much of that is just the room and the room size. But I definitely noticed it, and I think bigger, more expensive subwoofers would be a bit cleaner through that region. So it's a minor thing, but it's important to be honest. But I've got to say the bass overall from the Classic 98 was fast, nimble, light on its feet, very versatile because you could have big bold pressure in dance music with just as much quality as big guitar or double bass on other music. And I could not tell where the bass was coming from. Was it coming from the REL or was it coming from the speakers? I could not tell until I unplugged the REL. I found the Classic 98 complemented the missions perfectly with just one subwoofer being enough. Two would have been better, of course, one for each speaker, but one was enough. One was good enough, fast enough and big enough, but two definitely would be better. And that leads me just to talk about one last thing, and that would be bass character. And that's a really weird thing for me to talk about because I know that bass is just pressure. It's just pressure that we hear. And because it's just pressure, I think we can listen to the same music across different speakers, different subwoofers, and that bass can sound very, very similar because it's just pressure. And I'm not going to sit here and say that the bass from the Classic 98 was wildly different from other speakers and subwoofers that I've listened to, because it wasn't. But in saying that, I have heard some subwoofers that deliver their bass more mechanically. It's just kind of like a stop-start mechanical bass. And the Classic 98's bass delivery is literally the polar opposite to that. It's got like a lovely smooth transition. As it transitions between notes, it's really, really lovely and smooth from higher up to deeper down. It's just lovely and smooth with a nice rounded kind of character to it. And this is something that does stand out to me. You can hear it clear as day in this listening room. Stands out to me really with some speakers and subwoofers. They just have what I class as a slightly more pleasing bass. I don't know what causes it. I don't know where it comes from, but I notice it, I like it, and I just appreciate it. I think to sum up this review, I wanted to find out if the REL Classic 98 would be a good subwoofer to use with my Mission 770. And I can say I think it's the perfect subwoofer for them, and it would be a great subwoofer to use with lots of speakers of this ilk. There's loads, isn't there? Wharfdale's Lintons, Dentons, 700s, KLH, Revival Audio. There's lots of this type of speaker, and you can aesthetically match the speaker in the subwoofer and still get fantastic performance. So I think for that reason alone, it's definitely a subwoofer that I can recommend. It's well worth checking out if that kind of aesthetic matching is important to you and you value good sound, really nice, smooth, quality bass. The premium, slightly premium price, I think, for the Classic 98 will be worth it to you. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you enjoyed it, as always, hit the thumbs up button. If you appreciate my take on subwoofer reviewing in this instance, please consider subscribing to the channel.